He saw a quiet nurse in her late 50s moving through the pediatric neuro wing with the kind of invisibility that comes from years of making no waves. He didn't see the steadiness in Margaret Walsh's hands when she checked 8-year-old Connor Hayes's pupils with a penlight, the precision of someone who'd worked under worse conditions than fluorescent lights and climate control. He didn't see the faded Navy SEAL unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining that she touched once, just once, before every shift, a ritual so quiet it made no sound. St. Michael's Hospital in Raleigh smells like antiseptic and something else underneath, something that lives in pediatric units where children stop moving and parents stop sleeping. Margaret moves through these corridors like water finding its level, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a bun so tight it could have been military regulation, sensible shoes silent on linoleum that reflects the kind of fluorescent lights that make everyone look like they're already dying. She has a slight tremor in her left hand from old nerve damage, a tremor that stops the moment her fingers touch a patient's skin, as if the act of caring steadies something deeper than muscle. Connor Hayes has been unresponsive for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the car accident that fractured his skull in 3 places and left him in a state that the medical literature calls minimally conscious, a clinical phrase that means a child is alive but nobody knows if he's home. His father, Lieutenant Hayes, is currently deployed with Naval Special Warfare Development Group somewhere in the Hindu Kush, unreachable except by encrypted video calls that come through once every 10 days at odd hours when the time zones align and the satellites cooperate. Margaret first saw Connor on a Tuesday morning when Dr. Pierce swept through the unit with his entourage, 2 residents, a medical student, and a nurse practitioner who all moved in his wake like pilot fish around a shark. Dr. Pierce is 53 years old, wears suits that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, and has the kind of jawline that could cut glass if glass needed cutting. His wire-rimmed glasses catch the light in a way that makes his eyes impossible to read. He barely glanced at Margaret when she stood at the bedside checking Connor's Glasgow coma scale, reviewing the numbers that define how far gone a child has become, 3 for eye response, 2 for verbal, 3 for motor. 8 out of 15. The kind of score that makes families start planning funerals. Palliative pathway only, Dr. Pierce said, not to Margaret but into the space above her head, the way doctors speak about rather than to nurses. His voice had the texture of someone used to being obeyed. The brain damage is irreversible. Prepare the family for the end-of-life conversation. The residents nodded. The student wrote something in his notebook. Nobody asked Margaret what she thought. She wasn't supposed to think. That was the unspoken rule at St. Michael's, as understood as the color of scrubs and the direction of blood flow. Nurses followed protocols. Doctors made decisions. Margaret had worked in hospitals for 32 years, though nobody here knew that her experience included 3 tours in places that didn't appear on most maps, field thoracotomies performed with whatever tools were available when a combat knife was sharper than a scalpel, 30-hour surgeries under fire that left her hands capable of things she'd never discussed with her colleagues in Raleigh. Connor's mother, Patricia Hayes, arrived that afternoon with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of 6 weeks without sleep. She sat in the plastic chair next to the bed and held her son's hand the way mothers do, like holding the hand might transfer will through her fingertips, might send the message down through skin and bone that he was needed, that the world outside this room had not forgotten him, that his father was coming home and Connor needed to be awake when he arrived. She talked to him about school. About his favorite video game. About the dog waiting at home. About everything except the thing they were all thinking, that 8-year-old boys are not supposed to lie still. Margaret brought Patricia a cup of water that she didn't ask for but absolutely needed. She checked Connor's vitals, heart rate steady at 74, blood pressure normal, oxygen saturation at 98%. The boy's body was working. Everything except the part that made him Connor was operating normally, which somehow made it worse. It was during the 3rd night shift that Margaret noticed something. Connor's mother had left at 10 o'clock, promising to be back at 6. The room was quiet except for the ventilator's wheeze, that mechanical rhythm that sounds like the hospital itself breathing for you. Margaret was changing Connor's for when his eyes moved. Just slightly. Just enough. His pupils tracked the movement of her penlight as she swept it across his field of vision, following the light with the kind of automatic response that the other doctors had dismissed as reflex, mere nerve firing without intention, meaningless. But Margaret had seen that look before. She had seen it in the eyes of men pulled from rubble with their spinal cord severed, men whose brains were still fighting even when the rest of their bodies had surrendered. She knew the difference between a reflex and awareness. A reflex was noise. This was signal. She didn't write it in the chart. Not yet. Not in a way that would draw attention. She simply began to watch. During her shifts, between medications and vital sign checks, she observed Connor in the way she'd been trained to observe on deployment, looking for patterns, for evidence of intention, for the smallest indication that someone was still in there, still fighting, still home. Dr. Pierce came through again on Friday morning. His suit was charcoal grey this time, his presence moving through the unit like a ship cutting through water, the air pressure actually changing as he passed. He was reviewing Connor's chart with the kind of speed that meant he wasn't really reading it, just confirming that what he'd already decided was still true. Margaret was at the monitor station when he glanced in her direction. Anything new? His tone suggested he already knew the answer and was testing whether she would lie. Patient remained stable, Margaret said quietly. Vitals within normal parameters. And consciousness? No change, doctor. He nodded once and moved on, his entourage following. But Margaret had felt something shift in that moment, some small weight settling into place. She had answered his question with precision and without enthusiasm. She had given him no reason to think she was anything but a competent nurse doing her job exactly as it was supposed to be done. What she didn't tell him was that Connor's eyes had tracked her movement 3 times during the night shift. What she didn't mention was that when she'd spoken Connor's name softly, not loud enough for anyone to hear, just loud enough for the boy to hear, his eye response had changed, become sharper, more directed. What she didn't record in the official chart was that at 2:17 in the morning, when the hospital was at its quietest and the night shift nurses were scattered across 3 floors, she had placed her hand on Connor's shoulder and felt something move beneath it that wasn't involuntary. Margaret touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining as she left the hospital that morning. The patch was faded now, almost transparent in places, but the call sign was still visible, Nightingale 6. She had worn it under her clothes for 7 years, since the day she'd walked away from that life and into this one, a woman with 32 years of nursing experience and 0 official record of where most of it had come from. 15 different doctors across 3 hospitals had already signed off on Connor's case. 15 medical professionals with credentials and board certifications and the weight of institutional authority behind their assessments. They had all looked at the boy and seen only what the scan showed: irreversible damage, no hope, end-of-life planning. But Margaret had seen something else. She had seen a child whose brain was still trying to wake up. She had seen the small, steady flame of consciousness that every other physician in this hospital was prepared to let go out. And she had made a decision that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. She had decided that Connor Hayes deserved the same chance that she'd given to soldiers bleeding out in Kandahar, the same refusal to quit that had kept 3 CIA operatives alive for 30 hours until extraction, the same absolute belief in possibility that had defined her entire military career. What she didn't know was that this decision would cost her everything. But that wasn't the worst part. Lieutenant James Hayes arrived at St. Michael's on a Tuesday morning in October, his dress blue still creased from the flight, his eyes the color of ash. 72 hours. That was all they'd granted him, a compassionate leave window to say goodbye to his son. He didn't know Connor had squeezed Margaret's hand the night before. Margaret hadn't told him yet. She was still sorting through what she'd seen, what she could prove, what would sound like hope instead of delusion from a nurse who'd been warned twice already. Hayes moved through Connor's room like a ghost in uniform, pulling the metal chair close to the bed, taking his son's small hand, the one that hadn't moved in 6 weeks, and holding it as if the pressure alone could rewire the damaged neural pathways. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed. Margaret watched from the doorway, giving him privacy, when Dr. Pierce arrived. He didn't knock. He never did. Pierce pushed past her into the room, his white coat moving like a sail, his posture carrying the kind of confidence that came from being right so many times he'd stopped considering the possibility of being wrong. He was a tall man with silver temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Margaret had learned to recognize the precise moment his jaw shifted, the way his eyes flattened when he was about to weaponize something. "Lieutenant Hayes," Pierce said, not unkindly. "I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss reality." Hayes looked up, hope flickering across his face like a match struck in wind. "Your son experienced catastrophic traumatic brain injury," Pierce continued, positioning himself between Margaret and the family like a physical barrier. 6 weeks of complete unresponsiveness. 15 different physicians across 3 medical institutions have evaluated him. 15. Do you understand what unanimous clinical consensus means? "Yes, sir," Hayes said quietly. "It means we're certain." Pierce's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Your son is gone. The body in this bed is sustaining itself through machines and medication. What we're doing now isn't medical care. It's prolonging suffering." Margaret's breath caught. Not audibly. Just a small catching in her chest that she'd learned decades ago to suppress. She'd heard this speech before, from military doctors in field hospitals, from specialists in ICUs, from men who spoke in certainties because uncertainties threatened their sense of control. "Nurse Walsh has been providing you false hope," Pierce said, finally acknowledging her presence with a glance sharp enough to draw blood. "She's emotionally attached to your son's case in a way that's frankly unprofessional. She doesn't have the neurological training to understand what she's observing. She sees a twitch and interprets it as recovery. She sees reflex and calls it intention." Hayes turned to look at Margaret, and she saw it happen the moment his desperation grasped at the easier answer, the one that let him stop fighting. His shoulders dropped a quarter-inch. "Your son deserves dignity," Pierce said. "Not false hope. Not this." He gestured at the machines with the contempt of a man disposing of something already dead. Margaret stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was steady as a metronome. "Lieutenant, I need to speak with you about what I observed last night." "You'll do no such thing," Pierce said without turning around. "You're a bedside nurse, Walsh. You're not a diagnostician. And frankly, I'm concerned that your attachment to this case has compromised your professional judgment." The silence that followed was the silence of a man waiting for a woman to know her place. Hayes's eyes moved between them like a spectator at a match he didn't have the training to judge. The machines beeped. The ventilator hissed. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the sound of electromagnetic coils working at frequencies just below human hearing. Margaret took one measured breath. She felt the tear form, not from sadness or anger, but from the precise pressure of restraint, the way a glass fills with water until one molecule more creates overflow. She let it escape, watched it slide down her cheek, and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Pierce. "I've seen men survive worse than this in places you couldn't find on a map, Doctor," she said quietly. "In Kandahar. In field hospitals. In conditions that would have made you believe they were gone. Connor deserves the same chance they got." Pierce's face flushed the color of raw meat. "That romantic notion is exactly what I'm talking about. You're a nurse, not a miracle worker. You're not a neurologist. And you're certainly not qualified to contradict me in front of a patient's family." "Permission to continue my rounds?" Margaret asked, already stepping back, already knowing the answer before she asked it. Already knowing this was the moment everything shifted. "We'll discuss your future at St. Michael's on Monday morning," Pierce said, his voice dropping into registers that sounded like a closing door. "For now, I suggest you focus on your current patients and let the physicians make clinical decisions." She left the room. Behind her, she heard Hayes asking Pierce questions in a voice that had lost its sharp edges, questions that came from a man deciding to stop fighting. The door closed. Margaret stood in the hallway, her hands steady, her breathing controlled, the faded Navy SEAL unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining suddenly feeling heavier than it had in years. 2 days later, a printout appeared on the staff bulletin board at the nurse's station. Margaret saw it before anyone called her over to look. The lettering was bold. The message was plain. Written warning, Nurse M. Walsh. Unprofessional emotional attachment to patient Connor Hayes. provision of false hope and medical opinions beyond scope of practice. Further violations will result in immediate termination per hospital policy. Signed, Dr. Christopher Pierce, Chief Pediatric Neurology. She read it once. She didn't need to read it again. The subtext was louder than the text. Everyone would know. Everyone would understand that Margaret Walsh had been marked as a problem. That the problem had official documentation now. That speaking to her was speaking to someone the hospital had already deemed deficient. 3 nurses clustered near the copy machine went quiet when she walked past. One of them, Jennifer, who Margaret had covered shifts for last spring when her daughter got pneumonia, called out St. Margaret with a voice full of poison. The nickname landed like something designed specifically to wound. Not because of what it said, but because of how casually it was used to dismiss everything Margaret had ever tried to do for any patient. The next day in the break room, Margaret opened her lunch container, a sandwich on wheat bread with turkey and mustard, something she'd made that morning in the dark of her kitchen while listening to the pre-dawn rain on the roof. She sat at the table where 3 other nurses were finishing their sandwiches. For approximately 8 seconds, nobody moved. Then one of them, Marcus, the respiratory tech who Margaret had taught proper ventilator weaning protocols to 2 months prior, gathered his trash without making eye contact. Then Jennifer. Then the 3rd nurse, whose name Margaret had never learned. They moved to the opposite side of the break room with the fluid synchronization of a school of fish. Margaret sat alone with her cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom" in faded letters, a thing her son Daniel had given her 15 years ago, before everything about her had to be erased and rewritten. The mug had survived 6 moves, 2 career terminations, and 1 Black Ops debrief that had lasted 42 hours. She held it now and drank coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching the space where people used to sit with her. The isolation was strategic. It was intelligent. It was the kind of thing a competent antagonist did, not crude bullying, but the systematic removal of Margaret's social infrastructure. Without witnesses, without colleagues who might ask questions, without the casual conversations that happened in break rooms and supply closets, Margaret became a ghost on her own shift. People didn't greet her anymore. They didn't ask her opinion. They didn't trust her observations because a written warning, once posted, carried the weight of institutional truth. On Friday, the blow came in public. Margaret was charting at the nurses' station, a long peninsula of desks where 5 computers glowed against the afternoon light like a row of accusatory eyes. Dr. Pierce approached from the direction of the elevators, his footsteps loud on the linoleum, his white coat moving behind him like something alive. Margaret became aware of her own breathing. She became aware of exactly how many people were watching. "Your shift notes," Pierce said, not bothering with pleasantries, "are sloppy." Margaret's pen continued moving. O2 sat 86%. Heart rate 104. Respiratory rate 18. The facts of her work, documented, defended, impersonal. "Your response times to call lights are poor," Pierce continued, his voice pitched to carry. 2 residents at the far end of the station turned to watch. A medical student pretended to review a chart. "I'm frankly questioning whether someone your age should be doing critical care." One of the residents, a young man Margaret didn't recognize, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was the sound of permission. The sound of understanding that it was acceptable to agree with him now. Margaret set down her pen. The action was precise. Deliberate. She drew in 1 measured breath, pulled the corner of one eye with her index finger to clear the moisture that had appeared there, and looked directly at Pierce. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that the people at the station had to stop moving to hear it. "Permission to continue my rounds, doctor." The question hung in the air like a challenge, except it was phrased as a request. Except she was still performing deference even as something harder moved beneath it, something that had learned in Kandahar how to smile while maintaining operational security, how to ask permission while doing exactly what she'd already decided to do. Pierce waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, by all means. While you still have rounds to do." The threat was so perfectly placed that nobody in the station could claim they hadn't heard it. The message was delivered in the presence of witnesses. Margaret understood what she was looking at the moment before termination. The moment before her access was revoked, her credentials questioned, her entire presence at St. Michael's reduced to a liability. She stood up. The room seemed to shift slightly, or perhaps that was just what happened when you became aware of how many people were watching you disappear. Margaret moved through the hallway toward Connor's room, her feet carrying her on routes memorized through 3 months of shift work. The fluorescent lights overhead tracked her progress like a spotlight. The machines hummed their constant frequency. And inside her jacket, sewn into the lining where Pierce could never find it, the faded unit patch from a world she wasn't supposed to remember seemed to pulse with weight. She had 72 hours before Monday. She had a patient who had squeezed his father's hand. She had a modified Glasgow protocol from a life she couldn't claim and a decision that was going to cost her everything. She made it anyway. The alarm on Margaret's phone vibrated at 4:27 a.m. She was already awake. Sleep had stopped coming 6 weeks ago. Around the same time 15 different doctors had signed their names to the same conclusion: Connor Hayes was gone. The consensus was efficient, thorough, and wrong. She knew this because she had spent the last 18 days watching a child's brain wake up in increments no neurologist had bothered to measure. 5 a.m. was her window before the hospital exhaled into its daytime rhythm. Before Dr. Pierce arrived. Before the fluorescent lights hummed their full intensity and the morning shift turned everything into protocol and policy and the slow, careful business of giving up. The parking lot was empty except for 3 cars and a delivery truck. October rain slicked the asphalt, and Margaret's combat boots, the one she'd worn to Kandahar, the one she kept laced in her locker under a false bottom, made no sound on the wet concrete. She had learned long ago that silence was a skill. You walked a certain way. You breathed a certain way. You became the kind of person whom nobody noticed until the moment they had no choice. The scrubs she wore were generic blue, the badge that said Margaret Walsh, RN was standard issue, and the small unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one Lieutenant Hayes had given her 7 years ago in a field hospital she couldn't officially acknowledge, was close enough to her heart that nobody could ever find it. She pulled the badge over her head as the elevator doors closed. Pediatric ICU at 5 a.m. smelled like antiseptic and the faint copper undertone of blood cleanup. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm in the darkness. Most monitors were dim except for the 3 patients still fighting. Connor's room was at the end of the hall, the one with the DNR order taped to the door in Dr. Pierce's careful handwriting. Margaret had read it 3 times. Do not resuscitate. As if Connor's father, Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, deployed to Al-Anbar province 6 weeks ago, on emergency leave for a week that had just ended, didn't have the right to change his own son's fate. As if a man who had extracted 3 captured CIA operatives from a black site with nothing but field medicine and 42 minutes before the extraction birds arrived couldn't recognize the difference between dying and resting. She pushed open the door with her hip, hands already moving toward the monitors. Muscle memory took over. Her fingers found the Glasgow coma scale chart she had printed from her own research files, not the hospital's official version that had stopped being updated when everyone agreed to stop looking. The Glasgow Protocol. She had used it on blast victims in Kandahar, on soldiers who the field trauma surgeons had triage tagged with the color that meant expectant care. Some of them had come back. Not all. But enough to know that the protocol could measure the smallest movements the human brain was capable of generating. A microsecond of pupil dilation. The infinitesimal twitch of a muscle that wanted to move. The kind of response that looked like nothing to someone who wasn't looking for it. Connor's eyes were closed. His small chest rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm. 8 years old. The explosion that took him had been an IED, a roadside device that had detonated 3 meters from the convoy. Connor hadn't been in the convoy. He had been in his 2nd grade classroom in Raleigh, 4,847 miles away, when his father's men had taken the shrapnel. But trauma ripples outward. The blast had come through the phone lines of a video call, not a physical explosion but somehow worse, the sound of something catastrophic, the sudden silence that followed, the hours before confirmation arrived that Lieutenant Hayes was alive. Connor had stopped speaking after that. Then he had stopped moving. Then the seizures came, and the medically induced coma, and the 6 weeks of nothing that had brought him here, to this room, to this moment where Margaret was checking his pupils at 5:15 a.m. while the rest of the hospital slept. She used a penlight no thicker than a fountain pen. The pupil constricted. Not much. A millimeter, perhaps less. But present. Measurable. She wrote it down in the leather notebook she kept in her pocket, the one that had no hospital logo, no official stamp. Just numbers. Times. Observations. 5:16 a.m. Right pupil, 3 mm to 2 mm constriction. Consensual. Symmetrical. Response time, 1.2 seconds. She had been recording these for 18 days. The neurological staff used terms like spontaneous and reflexive and meaningless and unaware. Margaret used different language. She used the language of her own training, the language she had learned keeping men alive when medical school had been replaced by combat medicine, and the difference between death and recovery was measured in seconds and understood in her hands. She moved to the range of motion assessments. Her fingers, which had held together a femoral artery with nothing but pressure and a field tourniquet, were gentle against Connor's small arm. She bent it slowly. Noted the resistance. The muscle tone was better than it had been a week ago. Not much better. But better. She wrote it down. She checked his eye tracking next. She held the penlight at the corner of his vision and moved it slowly across his field. His eyes followed. Just a fraction. Just enough that nobody else seemed to notice anymore because everyone had stopped looking. She had the Glasgow Protocol open on her phone, a version modified from a military medical database that most civilian nurses would never access. She scored him at 8 out of 15. Still in the coma scale. Still significant. Still impossible according to Dr. Pierce, who had told Connor's father that the boy's brain was dead, that the electrical activity they were seeing was residual and meaningless, that the only kind thing to do was let him go. Margaret documented everything. She photographed the monitor readings with her phone. She wrote timestamps alongside the Glasgow scores. She measured pupil response using the standard millimeter scale. She recorded respiration patterns, heart rate variability, any twitch or movement that the machines registered but the humans had stopped expecting. This was the work that would cost her everything. She knew it. She was doing it anyway because she had learned in Kandahar that some decisions were simple: you either saved the life in front of you or you didn't. Afterward, you lived with whatever came next. By 5:33 a.m., the sun had not yet risen. Margaret heard the first stirrings of the day's shift in the hallway, someone's coffee cup, footsteps, the electronic chirp of a code button being tested. She folded her observations into the notebook and tucked it back into her pocket. She stood at Connor's bedside and did something she had never done during her official shift. She took his small hand and held it. Not as a nurse checking for reflexes. As a person. Someone who had held other small hands in other wars and knew that the difference between life and death sometimes came down to the single fact of being seen. Being remembered. Being worth the effort of continuing when everything else said to stop. Connor's fingers didn't squeeze back. Not yet. But the muscles in his hand shifted almost imperceptibly. Margaret felt it. She was looking for it. She wrote down the time, 5:51 a.m. She left before the morning shift arrived. Thursday morning brought rain hard enough to blur the parking lot. Margaret worked her regular shift, vitals, medications, the careful choreography of bedside care that kept everything running on the surface while she documented something else underneath. The neurological team had stopped visiting Connor's room with the same frequency. Why return to a case that was already closed? Dr. Pierce had moved on to children who could actually be saved. But Margaret noticed everything. She noticed the shift in Connor's breathing patterns. She noticed the way his eyes had begun to track light without the full 3-second delay they had shown 2 weeks ago. She noticed the minute muscle development in his hands from the passive range of motion work she was doing at 5 a.m., before anyone else arrived, before the official protocol of palliative care took over the room. She was working outside her scope. She knew this. She was modifying a physician's orders. She knew this too. She was giving false hope to a grieving parent. She had heard Dr. Pierce use that exact phrase, his voice cutting through the pediatric ICU like a knife, his hand on her shoulder in front of the whole morning shift. What she was actually doing was saving a child's life using protocols that civilian hospitals didn't employ because they didn't have the populations that military medicine did. Blast victims. TBI survivors who woke up 3 weeks after everyone said they wouldn't. She had seen the Glasgow Protocol pull men back from places where the medical consensus said they were gone. She had learned to trust the protocol more than she trusted authority. That Thursday afternoon, something shifted. Margaret was giving Connor his 2 p.m. medications, checking the foresight, documenting the clear sign that his pupils were no longer symmetrical. The left was responding 1/10 of a second faster than the right, which meant the edema was resolving, which meant the brain was organizing itself around the injury instead of drowning in it. She heard footsteps that didn't belong to the regular shift. Quick. Authoritative. The door opened without a knock. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway with a tablet in his hands. His expression was the kind of careful that meant he had already made decisions. Margaret. Step away from the patient. She completed her medication check. Documented it. Check the time. 2:14 p.m. Only then did she turn to face him. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same as it had been for 18 days. Quiet. Deferential. The voice of someone who knew her place. Connor's responding well too. I reviewed the records. The entire nursing log. 18 days of off-shift hours. Modified assessment protocols. Glasgow scoring that isn't part of this patient's care plan. A formal DNR order that you seem to have decided didn't apply to you. He moved closer to the bed. Not to check on Connor. To make a point. You're practicing outside your scope of practice, Margaret. You're countermanding physician orders. And you're setting this family up for a lawsuit when this boy dies. When? Not if. The certainty in his voice was absolute. Margaret looked at Connor. His eyes had opened slightly when Dr. Pierce spoke, as if the anger in the room had registered somewhere in the boy's injured consciousness. She saw the pupil response. The subtle muscle engagement. The fact that a child everyone had decided was gone had just demonstrated awareness of his environment. She saw all of it and said nothing. I'm going to need you to step back. To stop these unauthorized interventions. To understand that what you're doing isn't compassionate. It's cruel. Dr. Pierce set the tablet on the bedside table. Margaret saw the screen, a hospital memo. A formal employment review. The machinery of termination had already started. We'll discuss this with administration tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I need you off this case. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She didn't speak. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to defend yourself. Refuse to explain. Refuse to give the people who had already decided anything they could use against you. She pulled on the jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the patch nobody would ever think to look for, and walked out of Connor's room. What she didn't know was that Marcus Hayes, Connor's father, was still in the hospital. He had extended his leave by another day. He was sitting in the family lounge 3 rooms down, visiting hours not yet over, and he had heard Dr. Pierce's entire statement through the open door. Lieutenant Hayes, who had seen the boy wake up 4 hours ago, who had been present at 1:53 p.m. when Connor's hand had squeezed his father's hand with deliberate purpose, was already reviewing the patient file on his phone. The same file Margaret had been secretly updating. The same Glasgow protocols that Lieutenant Hayes recognized from his own combat medicine training. The same evidence that his son wasn't gone. He was coming back. That night, Margaret sat in her car in the hospital parking lot as rain hammered the windshield like applause for something nobody should celebrate. She had 48 hours before the termination hearing. She had saved a child from a medical consensus of 15 doctors. She had done everything right and was about to lose her job for it. But Connor was squeezing his father's hand. Connor was tracking light. Connor was responding to the modified Glasgow protocol that every military trauma surgeon knew worked because they had seen it work 1,000 times on soldiers everyone else had written off as lost. She pulled out her leather notebook and reviewed the 18 days of documentation. Clear progression. Measurable improvement. Evidence that nobody official had bothered to look for. She didn't know that this was the moment when everything was about to change. Dr. Pierce's office phone call came at 11:16 a.m. on a Monday, while the hospital board chairman was on the 18th hole at Raleigh Country Club. Pierce didn't apologize for the interruption. "We have a credential crisis," he said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "One of our nurses has been implementing unauthorized protocols. I need this investigated before it becomes a liability." The chairman, still holding his putter, listened to 40 seconds of Pierce's carefully constructed narrative and said, "I'll call Dorsey. We'll move fast." That was all it took. The machinery that protects institutional reputations is older and more efficient than mercy. By noon, Pierce had already made 3 phone calls to Margaret's employment references, a clinic in Portland that closed in 2019, a private practice that forwarded him to a disconnected number, and a VA hospital in San Diego where the supervising physician claimed no record of anyone named Margaret Walsh ever working there. It didn't matter that Margaret had spent 5 years in that San Diego facility as a field medic with no official documentation. The absence of records was the record itself. Pierce documented each non-response. 5 years ago, Margaret had emerged from erasure like a diver breaking the surface, given a civilian social security number, a nursing license processed through unofficial channels, and explicit orders never to mention the 15 years that came before. The silence she'd been ordered to keep was now being weaponized against her. By 2:15 p.m., Pierce had contacted Cassandra Chen, the hospital's credentialing officer, with a formal request for a fraud investigation. "Run everything," he told her. "Background, licensing history, employment verification. I suspect credential irregularities." Chen was meticulous. She made calls to the North Carolina Board of Nursing, checked Margaret's continuing education hours, all legitimate, all clean, and then turned to the employment gap. One phone call to the nursing school where Margaret claimed her BSN came from in 2009 confirmed the degree but raised questions about where she'd worked in the intervening years before arriving at St. Michael's. By 3:53 p.m., Chen had requested a formal credentialing review. By 3:38 p.m., Administrator Dorsey had been briefed. By 4:24 p.m., Pierce had recommended immediate termination pending investigation. The speed was deliberate. The appearance of due process was the point. Margaret was called to Dorsey's office at 7:15 a.m. Tuesday morning. She knew. She'd seen Pierce's expression yesterday when Connor squeezed his father's hand. She'd watched the color drain from the doctor's face like water from a tub. She'd felt the institutional machinery shift. She arrived in fresh scrubs, her jacket buttoned, the faded unit patch still sewn inside the lining where no one could see it. Administrator Dorsey sat behind his desk. Dr. Pierce stood to his left, arms crossed, jaw tight. Cassandra Chen held a folder. 2 HR representatives sat like sentries on either side of a leather chair positioned in the center of the room, the chair they wanted her to sit in. "Ms. Walsh," Dorsey began, his voice careful and measured, the tone of a man reading from a script prepared by lawyers. "We've been conducting a credentialing review based on concerns raised regarding your employment history and qualifications." Margaret said nothing. She sat today. Her hands folded in her lap. Her breathing steady. Chen opened the folder. "Your references prior to 5 years ago are non-responsive or claim no knowledge of your employment." She read from a printed sheet. "Portland Clinic states they have no records of your employment. San Diego VA states they have no record of you. The private practice in Tucson no longer exists. That's 3 institutions where you claim to have worked, Ms. Walsh, and none of them can verify your presence." "I was there," Margaret said quietly. "You may have believed you were there," Chen continued, her tone clinical. But we cannot verify employment prior to your hire date at St. Michael's 5 years ago. Additionally, your implementation of unauthorized treatment protocols in direct contradiction of attending physician orders represents a serious breach of hospital policy and scope of practice. Pierce leaned forward slightly. His voice came out smooth, victorious. You were told explicitly to cease unauthorized interventions. You refused. That's insubordination. Margaret looked at him. Her eyes were steady, the color of winter water. She didn't blink. The patient was improving. According to whose assessment? Pierce's voice rose slightly. The 15 neurologists across 3 hospitals who declared him a lost cause, or your personal belief that you know better than attending physicians? He smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd already won. You're a nurse, Ms. Walsh. You implement physician orders. You don't make medical decisions. Margaret said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth of her service was locked in classified vaults. The years she'd spent keeping soldiers alive in places that didn't officially exist, the field thoracotomy she'd performed with a combat knife when the surgical kit was lost in an ambush, the 3 CIA operatives she'd kept breathing during a 30-hour extraction under fire, all of it was buried under an erasure order so deep that her own son had grown up not knowing his mother had been a captain. The Pentagon had given her a new life and told her never to speak of the old one. That silence was now proof of fraud. Dorsey closed his eyes briefly, the gesture of a man performing regret. Ms. Walsh, based on our investigation, this hospital cannot verify your qualifications or your employment history. We are also concerned about your repeated insubordination. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Your nursing license remains valid. That's not our decision to make, but your credential status at this facility is revoked. The words came down like a gavel. Pierce stood. His posture straightened. He'd won what he came for. Connor was the secondary concern now. Margaret's credibility was destroyed. Any claim she made about the boy's improvement would be filed as the delusion of a fraud, the desperate fantasy of a nurse with forged credentials trying to justify her unauthorized protocols. The insurance billing would continue. The experimental scans would continue. The money would continue. Security will escort you to your locker, Dorsey said. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings. Margaret stood. She didn't stand slowly. She stood with the efficiency of someone who'd packed field kits in the dark and moved through corridors under fire. I understand, she said. The 2 security guards who'd been waiting in the hallway stepped forward. They were young men, probably 24 or 25, uncomfortable with the task of escorting someone who looked like she could be their mother's friend. One of them held the door. Margaret walked through it without looking back at Pierce, without looking at Dorsey, without looking at Chen. She walked with the kind of composure that makes people uncomfortable because they can't quite identify why. The locker room was empty. It was 7:02 a.m. The morning shift wouldn't start for another hour. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a surgical white. Margaret opened her locker, the same locker she'd opened every morning for 5 years, the same locker where she'd stored her jacket and her personal things. She pulled out the cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Best Mom" in faded blue letters. Daniel had given it to her when he was 9. She pulled out the dying succulent she'd kept on the shelf, a gesture toward something alive that she could care for. She pulled out the photograph in a plastic frame, Marcus on his last deployment, that exact moment before he walked toward the tarmac, the smile caught in the photograph that she hadn't seen in person since his funeral, a funeral she hadn't been allowed to attend because Captain Margaret Walsh didn't exist in any system that mattered. The erasure had already been in effect. His death was something she mourned alone. She put these things into a cardboard box that one of the security guards provided. The box was thin, cheap, the kind used for office moves. It was already beginning to fail in the humidity of the locker room. The mug's handle had a long crack running through it, visible now in the fluorescent light. "I'm sorry about this," one of the guards said. He was trying to be kind. "Not your job to be sorry," Margaret replied. "You're just following orders." She carried the box toward the staff exit. As she passed Connor's room, she paused for exactly 3 seconds. The boy was sleeping. His father was in the chair beside him, head tilted back, exhausted. The monitor showed steady rhythm. 68 beats per minute. The oxygen saturation the boy had been maintaining for the last 18 hours, 97%. Normal for a child. Impossible according to the 15 neurologists. Real because Margaret had seen it happen. She kept walking. The bus stop was 2 blocks from the hospital on a street that ran parallel to the main drag. The rain had started at 3:27 p.m., that cold October rain that comes without warning in North Carolina and stays for days. By 4:56 p.m., it was still falling, the kind of rain that soaks through cardboard boxes. Margaret stood at the shelter with 4 other people waiting. None of them looked at her. No one ever looks at nurses outside the hospital. Outside the hospital, she was just another woman in the rain holding a falling-apart box. The box was going soft. The corner where the mug sat had begun to collapse inward, the cardboard giving way to the weight of what she carried. The succulents pot had tipped over inside, soil spilling across the bottom. The photograph of Marcus, she was holding that in her other hand, trying to keep it dry, her fingers shielding the glass. A car passed. It splashed through a puddle and soaked her scrub bottoms to the knee. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching the water drip from the edge of the shelter, drip and drip and drip in a rhythm that matched her heart rate. The bus didn't come. The schedule said for 4:42 p.m. It was for 51 p.m. Another car passed. No splash this time. Then another. A woman with an umbrella hurried past without seeing her. An old man with a shopping bag stood down the line, equally invisible. Margaret looked at the photograph of her husband through the rain-speckled plastic. Marcus had been gone for 4 years. He died on a mission she couldn't attend the funeral for because she wasn't supposed to exist. The Department of Defense had sent a letter to her civilian address, careful not to reference anything classified, careful to give her nothing that could be evidence. She'd held the letter and understood that her husband had died in a way that she could never publicly mourn. Her son had lost his father and been told only that he died in service. Daniel had learned not to ask questions because his mother's answers were always the same: "I can't talk about that, sweetheart." The rain fell harder. The succulent was dead now, the soil was soaked, the pot was cracked. The mug was going soft at the edges. But the photograph of Marcus and the unit patch inside her jacket were still intact. The patch was Navy SEAL Team 3's insignia, given to her by Lieutenant Hayes 7 years ago in a field hospital in Kandahar when he'd squeezed her hand and whispered, "You are a guardian angel." She'd sewn it into her jacket that same night, stitching by hand in the dark because the guards had strict orders about what she could take home. The patch was the only physical proof that she had ever been Captain Margaret Walsh, medical officer, codename Nightingale 6. The only proof that the 15 years of her life had happened at all. The bus pulled up at 5:08 p.m. It was late. No one apologized. Margaret stepped on, still holding the failing cardboard box and the photograph of her husband. She took a seat by the window. She watched the hospital pass behind her, its lights glowing gold in the rain, and she cried, silently, one tear escaping before she caught it with the back of her hand. She didn't cry because she'd lost her job. She cried because she'd had to choose between her silence and her conscience, and silence had lost. 3 days would pass before anything changed. 3 days of sitting in her apartment, of Daniel asking questions she couldn't answer, of knowing that Connor was still in the hospital bed and that Dr. Pierce was still standing over him, declaring him a case worthy only of comfort measures. 3 days of the kind of isolation that erasure creates, the kind where your entire history becomes a lie that no one believes. 3 days passed in the kind of silence that erasure creates. Margaret stood at a bus stop in October rain, holding a cardboard box that had begun to soften at the edges. Inside, a photograph of Marcus in dress blues, a dying succulent from her hospital locker, a cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom," and nothing else that mattered. The rain fell like it was trying to wash her away entirely. She didn't know that Lieutenant Hayes had been making phone calls. She didn't know that her son Daniel had been digging through her apartment at 3 in the morning, searching for something she'd hidden so carefully that she'd almost hidden it from herself. She didn't know that a shadow box with a silver star inside was about to walk into a hospital board meeting and change everything. But that's exactly what happened at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday when the boardroom doors burst open and a furious teenage boy in a St. Michael's hoodie slammed a wooden shadow box onto the polished conference table directly in front of Dr. Pierce. The room went dead silent. "Mom, they need to see these," Daniel gasped, breathless from running, his voice shaking with the kind of rage that only comes when a kid realizes his parent has been treated as a liar. "You can't let them call you a fraud." The shadow box held everything the Pentagon had tried to erase, a silver star with its distinctive cross and laurel wreath catching the fluorescent light. 2 purple hearts. A certificate of valor. A unit patch from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. And underneath, pressed carefully against museum-grade backing, a photograph of a younger Margaret in desert camouflage, standing between 2 Army Rangers, her eyes the color of someone who had already seen the worst humanity could offer. Dr. Pierce's face went the color of old milk. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. That was the moment Lieutenant Hayes walked through the same doors, coming directly from Connor's bedside where his son had just squeezed his hand 3 times, once, twice, 3 times, with the kind of purposeful pressure that no reflex could explain. Hayes took exactly 4 steps into the room before he went pale. His jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice came out thin and distant, like he was hearing it from underwater. Nightingale 6. Not Margaret. Not Ms. Walsh. Nightingale 6. The call sign that had been classified so deep that even speaking it in the wrong room could end careers. "Captain Margaret Walsh," he whispered. Then louder, his voice cracking slightly, "Oh my God. You were my captain in Kandahar." Margaret stood motionless. The room wasn't breathing. Even the air seemed to have stopped moving. Hayes reached for the citation in the shadow box with hands that trembled for the first time in 18 years, and he began to read aloud, his words precise and official and absolutely devastating. "Captain Margaret Walsh, United States Navy, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, for extraordinary valor during Operation Enduring Freedom, Kuna Province, Kandahar Sector. During a 30-hour combat extraction operation under sustained enemy fire, Captain Walsh performed emergency field thoracotomy procedures on 12 personnel using field expedient equipment, including a combat knife and field sutures, maintaining surgical sterility in a non-sterile environment while under active fire from 3 separate positions. Of the 12 individuals requiring emergency surgery, 12 survived transport to definitive care. Captain Walsh refused medical evacuation twice during the operation despite personal injury. Her actions directly resulted in the preservation of 12 lives that would otherwise have been lost. Hayes's voice broke. He set the citation down carefully, like it might shatter. 12 men came home because of you. That's when Dr. Pierce made his mistake. He stood up, his composure finally cracking like thin ice, and his voice came out sharp and desperate. "This is clearly fabricated. Her records show no military service. Her credentials are unverified. This is a manipulation of this family's grief." The boardroom doors opened again. A 2-star general stepped through them, and the room transformed into something between a hospital conference space and a shrine. The general was in his mid-60s, gray at the temples, and his left leg moved with the careful precision of a prosthetic. He walked directly to the shadow box and saluted Margaret's silver star with a hand that shook visibly. His eyes were wet. "Captain Walsh," he said quietly. "General Mitchell Carver. You saved my legs at Bagram in 2016. Shrapnel from an IED. You operated on me for 4 hours while rockets were landing 200 meters away. You sang, I remember you singing, Semper Fidelis, to keep us calm while you worked. I've been a general for 6 years and I would have been nothing without you." He turned to face the board. "Dr. Pierce, Captain Walsh doesn't have unverified records. She has *classified* records. There's a difference. A profound one." Before Pierce could respond, the boardroom doors opened a 3rd time. Two men in dark suits entered with a kind of presence that made the hospital staff unconsciously straighten their spines. Federal credentials hung from their necks. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like a knife dragging across stone, stepped forward. "Dr. Richard Pierce," she said. "I'm Special Agent Rodriguez, FBI. We're here to inform this board that codename Nightingale 6 has been declassified as of 48 hours ago. Captain Margaret Walsh's military record is now available for verification. We've confirmed it directly with Pentagon records. We've also confirmed that you, Dr. Pierce, initiated a fraudulent disciplinary action against Captain Walsh 72 hours ago based on forged documents, which we have recovered from the hospital's digital system." The forensic accountant set 43 patient files on the conference table. "These are billing records," Rodriguez continued. "Connor Hayes appears here. 37 diagnostic scans over 6 weeks. Each billed at $8,400 to $12,000. The standard rate is $2,800. All scans ordered by you, Dr. Pierce. All routed through Lighthouse Diagnostics, which is owned by your brother-in-law, Thomas Pierce. You received monthly transfers of approximately $2,200 per patient, totaling $47,000 over 2 years." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that shapes futures. Connor Hayes wasn't the only one, the accountant said. 43 patients over 18 months. All carrying premium insurance. All conditions you declared hopeless, which meant families didn't ask questions about additional testing. You were farming them for kickbacks. The moment Captain Walsh began advocating for Connor's recovery, she became a threat to your billing scheme. Dr. Pierce's hands were shaking now. He reached for his phone. Before his fingers touched the screen, Agent Rodriguez was standing beside him with handcuffs already in her hand. "Dr. Richard Pierce, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted obstruction of justice by fabricating personnel records." They walked him out of the boardroom while he was still trying to speak, trying to explain, trying to invoke authority that had already been stripped from him like skin from bone. Margaret watched from the doorway as they escorted him through the hospital corridor. Nurses turned to stare. Residents whispered. A junior doctor pointed. By the time they reached the main entrance and put him into a federal vehicle in handcuffs, the entire hospital knew. His medical license was suspended within 2 hours. The state medical board opened an investigation before sunset. His wife filed for divorce the following Tuesday. By the time the plea deal was negotiated, 18 months federal prison, $340,000 in restitution, permanent loss of medical license, no one was surprised anymore. The only surprise was that he'd gotten away with it for as long as he had. Somewhere in a federal courthouse, Dr. Richard Pierce would learn that power was not a title. Power was something you earned through integrity, something you lost through greed, something that could be taken away in the space of a single confession. After prison, he would drive a medical supply van at $16 an hour, delivering equipment to the hospitals where he'd once reigned as chief neurologist. The irony was perfect and irrelevant. But Margaret didn't think about that yet. She was standing in Connor's room at 6 in the evening when the boy deliberately squeezed her hand. 3 times. Once, twice, 3 times. His father wept beside the bed, shoulders shaking, because all 15 doctors who had declared recovery impossible were now silent. Connor's eyes tracked movement. He responded to his father's voice. His neurological function was returning in increments that now seemed inevitable, though a week ago they had seemed impossible. Margaret reached down and straightened the faded Navy SEAL unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one Hayes had given her 7 years ago in a field hospital in Kandahar, after she'd operated on him for 5 hours straight, after she'd brought him back from the edge of nothing. He'd pressed it into her hand without a word. "Just in case," he'd whispered. "Just in case you ever need to know what you did matters." She'd carried it every day since. Through 15 years of erased records, through the classified operations that officially never happened, through 3 CIA operatives she'd saved and couldn't mention, through the funeral of her husband Marcus that she couldn't attend because she didn't exist on paper, through the bus stop in the rain. She had needed to know. And now, finally, he would know that she had known. Lieutenant Hayes stood at the bedside with his hand on his son's shoulder, and he turned to Margaret with the kind of gratitude that transcends words. "Thank you," he said. "For both of us. For both times." Connor reached up and squeezed her hand again, 3 times, purposeful and strong and alive. The night shift was beginning. Fluorescent lights hummed above them with a sound like electric hymns. Somewhere in the hospital, a medical supply van was being loaded by a man who had lost everything he'd ever thought mattered. Somewhere, federal agents were filing charges. Somewhere, a hospital was beginning the long process of institutional reform, of policy changes, of acknowledging the nurse they'd thrown away. But here, in Connor's room, in this quiet moment, none of that mattered. Margaret had done the work. The work that no one else would do. The work that earned her nothing but a title that had been classified and a life that had been erased. The work that saved 12 men in Kandahar. The work that saved a general's legs at Bagram. The work that brought a boy named Connor back from the edge of nothing because one nurse refused to believe that recovery was impossible. She had been invisible for so long that invisibility had become a choice. Subscribe to see the stories that prove ordinary people do extraordinary things when nobody's watching. Like this video if you believe that true heroism isn't about titles or rank. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And if you know someone who's been wrongly dismissed, share their story. Because the ones who've seen the worst are often the ones who give the most.